Welcome, everyone. Let us here, which will share stream. Just one person, which might just be me. The streams really aren't going. Really not going anywhere, doing anything. Um, 26, 28 on stream. Once. I guess start. Today, as the thing suggests, is going to be continuing to read The Jewish Question, a Marxist Interpretation by Abram Leon. Let's get started with that one. Last time, we started with the second chapter from antiquity to the Carolingian epoch, the period of commercial prosperity of the Jews. And we finished section A before the Roman conquest. Now we're up to section B, Roman imperialism and its decline. In contrast to modern imperialism, which is based essentially on the development of the productive forces, ancient imperialism was founded on the looting of conquered countries. For ancient imperialism, it was not a question of opening new roads for its products and its capital. Its objective was exclusively the despoiling of conquered countries. Given the backward state of production in antiquity and the possessing classes of the conquering countries, given the backward state of production in antiquity, the possessing class of conquering countries could maintain themselves in luxury only by the more or less rapid ruination of the conquered peoples. Exhaustion of the conquered countries, growing difficulties in making new conquests, the gradual softening of the conquerors, all these sooner or later brought about the decline of ancient imperial powers. Rome provides the classic example of ancient imperialism. There have been great exaggerations concerning the commercial and industrial development of Rome. Its trade always showed a deficit. Rome drew exports from the provinces without giving anything back in return. The Roman ruling classes heartily despised every kind of trade. The Claudian law, 218 BC, forbade senators, their sons, and the entire aristocracy of Rome to own ships drawing more than 300 amphoras, which corresponds to less than 225 bushels of grain or vegetables. This was equivalent to forbidding them to engage in trade. Caesar renewed this ban. Roman policy was never determined by its so-called commercial interests. The best proof of this is that Rome, after the defeat of Hannibal, 202 BC, still allowed the Carthaginians to bar entry into their sea. In general, it must be said that the Roman economic problems were unusually simple. The gradual conquest of Italy and the provinces more than occupied the surplusage of capital and population, so that there was no crying need for industry and commerce, writes Tenny Frank. Traders in Rome were, as a rule, foreigners, and that, moreover, explains the continuous growth of the Jewish colony in Rome from Caesar's epoch on. Roman businessmen were not traders, but usurers who looted the provinces. The development of trade in the Roman Empire must, above all, be ascribed to the growing luxury requirements of the ruling classes of Rome. Strabo explains the development of the great market of Delos is fashion. Hence arose the proverbial saying, merchant come into port, discharge your freight, everything is sold. The Romans, having acquired wealth after the destruction of Carthage and Corinth, employed great numbers of domestic slaves. The same was true of industry. Roman industry depended primarily on the luxury requirements of the aristocracy. Tenny Frank, after observing that no appreciable progress was made in the domain of industry in the 4th century BC, adds, in the 2 succeeding centuries, we do not find evidence of any marked change in the nature of production in Rome. Doubtless, the amount of ordinary were produced at home increased with the growth of the city, but of goods worthy of export we do not hear. The only difference now is that work previously performed by free labour began in the 2nd century to fall into the hands of slaves. Even those authors who consider that Italy had been a producer country in the Republican epoch admits that it ceased to be one in the imperial period. Italy becomes less and less a producer country. Several industries that were prosperous at the end of the Republican period are now in decline. Thus, trade between Italy and the Orient now takes place only in one direction. And it also becomes lodged more and more in the hands of Asiatics, of Alexandrians and Syrians. Thus, Italy now lived only on the exploitation of the provinces. Small property, the foundation of Roman strength, was progressively supplanted by vast domains serving the luxury needs of Roman aristocrats and on which slave labour predominated. Pliny's conclusion is known to all. Latifundia Perdidere Italian. Great estates are the ruin of the Italians. The slave became more and more an item of luxury rather than a factor of production. Horace, in one of his satires, states that a minimum of 10 slaves was the indispensable prerequisite of a gentleman. Thousands of slaves did in fact work in the vast latifundia. In the domains of Tusculum and Tver, on the shores of Terracina and Baiae, where the old Latin and Italian farmers had sown and reaped, there now rose in barren splendor the villas of the Roman nobles, some of which covered the space of a moderate-sized town with their appurtenances of garden grounds and aqueducts, fresh and saltwater ponds, preservation and breeding of river and marine fishes, nurseries of snails and slugs, game preserves for keeping the hares, rabbits, stags, roes and wild boars, and aviaries in which even cranes and peacocks were kept. At the same time that free labor was being eliminated by slave labor, Italy became an immense center of squandering the wealth drained from the entire empire. Crushing taxes ruined the provinces. The frequent and costly naval armaments and coast defenses in order to check piracy, the task of supplying works of art, wild beasts for other demands, the insane Roman luxury in circus, theatre, and chase were just as frequent as they were oppressive and incalculable. A single instance may show how far things were carried. During the 3 years' administration of Sicily by Gaius Verres, the number of farmers in Leontini fell from 84 to 32, in Moccia from 187 to 86, in Pavita 252 to 120, in Agerium from 250 to 80, so that in 4 of the most fertile districts of Sicily, 59% of the landholders preferred to let their fields lie fallow rather than to cultivate them under this regime. In the client states, the forms of taxation were somewhat different, but the burdens themselves were, if possible, still worse, since in addition to the exactions of the Romans, there came those of the native hordes. Roman capitalism, to the extent that the term capitalism is applicable here, was essentially speculative and bore no relationship whatever to the development of the productive forces. Roman trade and banking resembled organized brigandage. But still worse, if possible, and still less subject to any control, was the havoc committed by the Italian men of business among the unhappy provincials. The most lucrative portions of the landed property and the whole commercial and monetary business in the provinces were concentrated in their hands. Usury flourished as it had never flourished before. All the communities, it is said in a treatise published in 684, 70 BC, are ruined. The same truth is specially attested as regards Spain and Narbonese Gaul, the very provinces that, comparatively speaking, were still in the most tolerable economic condition. In Asia Minor, even towns like Samos and Halicarnassus stood almost empty. Legal slavery seemed here a haven of rest, fed the torments to which the free provincials succumbed, and even the patient Asiatic had become, according to the descriptions of Roman statesmen themselves, weary of life. Even the statesmen of Rome herself publicly and frankly conceded that the Roman name was unutterably odious in all Greece and Asia. Clearly, this system of parasitism and brigandage could not last indefinitely. The source of wealth from which Rome drew dried up. Long before the fall of Rome, we witnessed a steady slowing up of trade. The arena for pillage contracted in the measure that Rome drained the lifeblood of the conquered countries. The fact that the production of grain especially wheat, diminished, while the vine and olive tree conquered vast domains east and west, was an ominous token of the state of things. Luxury products displaced products that are indispensable for production and for reproduction of the labor force. The spread of the culture of vines and olive trees not only meant economic ruin for Italy, but might also result in a grain famine throughout the empire. Emperor Trajan vainly tried to ward off this danger by compelling senators to buy land in Italy. His successors achieved as little. Luxury killed off production. Soon, superb buildings will leave no more land for plough or toiler, Horace cried out. By the 3rd century, the decline in trade was complete. Relations with distant countries were cut off. Practically no Roman coin in the 3rd century had been found in India, which proves a breakdown of exchange between Rome and India. The decline of Egyptian agriculture became so pronounced in the 3rd century that it was necessary to forego a part of the deliveries of grain from this formerly wealthy province. These Egyptian deliveries had to be replaced by grain supplies from the province of Africa, the Algeria and Tunisia of today. Commodus, ruled 177 to 192 AD, found it necessary to establish a flotilla for transporting the grain grown in the province of Africa. We have seen that trade in the Roman Empire was primarily based on supplying the wealthy classes of Rome. Is there any wonder, then, that exhaustion of the provinces was followed by a decline in trade? More and more, Roman emperors were compelled to resort to requisitions in kind, which only resulted, however, in aggravating the lot of the suffering provinces. The system of requisitions was rampant. Grain, hides, wood, spears, and draught animals had to be delivered, and payment for them was irregular and indeed problematic. A purely natural economy, producing exclusively use values, slowly displaced the exchange of products. Whereas the Roman peace had formally brought about a regular exchange of goods, the equalizing of living conditions between the different regions of the empire, in the anarchy of the 3rd century, each country was often condemned to live on itself, painfully, poorly. An attempt has been made to explain the gradual displacement of slavery by the colonist system, an early form of tenant farming, either as a result of the lack of energy on the part of landed proprietors, or by a shortage of slaves caused by the termination of foreign wars. The gradual ruin of the colonies, the halt in the flow of their products, was probably the main reason. The great proprietors, more and more reduced to living on the products of their own lands, were interested in replacing slave labor, relatively low in productivity, by the colonist system, which resembles the system of serfdom that flourished in the Middle Ages. The colonist owes his master everything that the serf under feudalism will owe his lord. The power of the proprietors, who often possess enormous areas of land, kept growing continuously. In Egypt, in the 5th century, the peasants will be completely subject to them. State administration passed entirely into their hands. It is therefore quite inaccurate to view the natural economy that flourished in the Carolingian epoch as an outgrowth of the fall of the Roman Empire and the destruction of Mediterranean economic unity. Undoubtedly, the barbarian invasions played a very important role in the decline of ancient trade and in the rise of feudal economy. But the economic decline of the Roman Empire began long before the fall of Rome and several centuries before the Muslim invasion. Another very important indication of the evolution toward a natural economy was the monetary change that had already begun under the reign of Nero. Copper increasingly replaced gold and silver. In the 2nd century, there was almost complete dearth of gold. The development of a natural economy, of an economy primarily producing use values, was consequently far from being an abnormal phenomenon, as Pyrenees claims. The Roman Empire was ruined economically before it was ruined politically. The political blow to the Roman Empire was rendered possible only by its economic decline. The political anarchy of the 3rd century, like the barbarian invasion, can be explained accurately and exclusively by the economic decline of the Roman Empire. To the extent that the provinces were ruined, that an intensive exchange of goods ceased, and that a return took place to a natural economy, to that same extent, the very existence of the empire became a matter of indifference to the possessing classes. Each country, each province withdrew into its shell. The empire, with its immense administrative apparatus and its extremely costly army, became a cancer, a parasitic organism whose unbearable weight pressed down on all classes. Taxes devoured the sustenance of peoples. When the soldiers, after their great victories against the Marcomanni, 180 AD, demanded an increase in pay, Emperor Marcus Aurelius gave this significant reply. Everything you would receive from your usual pay would first have, everything you receive above your usual pay would first have to be drained from the blood of your relations. The treasury was exhausted. In order to maintain the administrative apparatus of the army, it was necessary to confiscate individual fortunes. While the lower classes were in ceaseless revolt, the possessing classes were turning away from the empire, which was ruining. After the economic ruin of the empire by the aristocracy was in turn by the empire. Every day people could be seen who only yesterday were still among the wealthiest, today have to take up the beggar's staff, said Herodian. The soldiers grew more and more bestial. It was not greed alone that forced them to despoil the inhabitants. Impoverishment of the provinces and the wretched state of transportation, which created difficulties in provisioning the armies, forced the soldiers to use violence in order to find their means of subsistence. Caracalla ruled to 11 to 17 AD, and granting Roman citizenship to all Roman inhabitants, sought only to increase the taxable population. Irony of history. The whole world became Roman when Rome was no longer any. The exactions of the Roman administration and the excesses of the soldiery incited all the inhabitants of the empire for its destruction. The quartering of soldiers was a real disaster. The population of Syria regarded an occupation by the Parthians as a relief in comparison with the prolonged stay of Roman troops. The Roman government appeared every day more odious and oppressive to its subjects. The severe Inquisition, which confiscated their goods and tortured their persons, compelled the subjects of Emperor Valentinian to prefer the more simple tyranny of the barbarians. They abjured and abhorred the name of Roman citizen, which had formerly excited the ambitions of mankind. The Christian writer Salvian stated in Gubernatione Dei. Hence, all the Romans in that region, Gaul and Spain, have but one desire, that they may never have to return to the Roman jurisdiction. Yet we are surprised that the Goths are not conquered by our resistance, when the Romans would rather live among them than at home. I could find occasion to wonder why all the poor and needy people do not follow their example, except for one factor that hinders them, namely, that they cannot transfer their poor possessions and homes, their households. Far from being an abnormal phenomenon, the barbarian invasion was the normal consequence of the economic and political decline of the empire. Even without the invasion, probably have been dismembered. In Asia Minor, as well as in Syria, one of the main developments was the gradual reversion to the feudal system. The so-called revolt of the Isaurians in Asia Minor is another symptom of the same tendency toward the formation of almost independent states within the empire. Similarly, the attempt to create an independent Gallo-Roman Empire, the attempts at secession, prove how weak the bond of empire had become. The barbarians only gave the coup de grace to the tottering edifice of the Roman state. The fundamental cause for the decline of the Roman Empire must be sought in the contradiction between the growing luxuriousness of the possessing classes, between the incessant growth of surplus value, and the static character of the mode of production. During the entire Roman epoch, very little progress was registered in the sphere of production. The tools of the cultivator retained their primitive form. Plough, spade, hoe, mattock, pick, fork, scythe, sickle, and pruning knife were, as the surviving specimens show, just as they had been handed down generation to generation. The growing luxury of the Roman aristocracy and the expenses of imperial administration were covered by a furious exploitation of provinces, which had as its consequence economic ruin, depopulation, exhaustion of the soil. Unlike the capitalist world, which must perish from the relative superabundance of means of production, the Roman world perished from their scarcity. The reforms of Diocletian, ruled 284 to 305, Constantine, ruled 306 to 337, were an attempt to set the Roman Empire on the foundations of a natural economy. The state will now be based on the countryside and its inhabitants. The peasant was now chained to his bit of land. Each landed proprietor became responsible for his domain and for the number of coloni who were established on it. The new tax was assessed on this basis. The reform of taxation by Diocletian and the edicts of later emperors made the colonist a serf, bound to his domicile and to his master. The same was true of the other layers of the population. Small proprietors, artisans, merchants, all were chained to their living place and to their profession. The epoch of Constantine is the epoch of the unlimited rule of the great landed proprietors, undisputed masters of vast princely domains. The aristocracy more and more abandons cities which fall into decay and flees to sumptuous country villas, where it lives surrounded by its retainers and its serfs. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine constituted attempts to adapt the empire to a natural economy. But we have seen that the empire had, on this basis, no reason for existence. Its various parts would be held together longer only by tyranny. Thus, if from the economic and social point of view, Constantine ushers in a new historical era, symbolized by the adoption of Christianity, from the political point of view, he opens the last act in the history of the Roman Empire. Share. C. Judaism and Christianity. The position the Jews had acquired in the Hellenistic epoch appears to have undergone no fundamental transformation after the Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BC. The privileges conferred upon the Jews by Hellenistic laws were confirmed by the Roman emperors. The Jews enjoyed a privileged position in the Roman Empire. The fact that nearly 1 million Jews lived in Alexandria alone is sufficient evidence of their primarily commercial role in the diaspora. Several centuries before the seizure of Jerusalem, 70 AD, it embraced 3.5 million Jews, whereas hardly 1 million continued to live in Palestine. Alexandria in Egypt, under the Roman emperors, was what Tyre had been in the epoch of Phoenician commercial glory. Under the reign of the Ptolemies, a direct trade between Egypt and India had been established. From Thebes, caravans went to Meroe in Upper Nubia, whose markets were also frequented by caravans from the interior of Africa. Under the Roman emperors, more than 200 ships sailed up the Nile each year, and more than 100 sailed the Red Sea to Persia, Arabia, and India in search of the precious products of these lands and to bring them goods from Europe. 2 out of the 5 sections of Alexandria were inhabited by Jews. The role of the Jews in Alexandria was so important that a Jew, Tiberius Julius Alexander, was appointed Roman governor of the city. From the cultural standpoint, these Alexandrine Jews were completely assimilated and no longer spoke anything but Greek. It was on their account that the Hebrew religious books had to be translated into that language. Communities similar to that of Alexandria were located in all the commercial centers of the empire. The Jews spread over Italy, Gaul, and Spain. Jerusalem continued to be the religious center of diaspora Judaism. The successors of David and Solomon were of hardly more significance for the Jews of that age than Jerusalem for those of the present day. The nation found, doubtless for its religious and intellectual unity, a visible rallying point in the petty kingdom of Jerusalem. But the nation itself consisted not merely of the subjects of the Hasmoneans, but of the innumerable bodies of Jews scattered through the whole Parthian and the whole Roman Empire. Within the cities of Alexandria especially, and of Cyrene, the Jews formed special communities administratively and even locally distinct, not unlike the Jews' quarters of our towns, but with a freer position and superintended by a master of the people as superior judge and administrator. Even at this time, predominant business of the Jews was trade. In the Sibylline books of the Maccabean period, 167 to 160 BC, it is stated that all the seas are overflowing with Jews. According to Strabo, it was not easy to discover a place in the entire world where Jews were not to be found and which was not ruled financially by them. Students of economy have no doubt that the majority of these Jews in antiquity depended on commerce and industry for their livelihood. Jerusalem was a great and wealthy city of 200,000 inhabitants. Its importance lay above all in the Temple of Jerusalem. The inhabitants of the city and of its suburbs lived primarily from the mass pilgrims who flocked to the holy city. The Jews of Palestine regarded their God as the means by which they lived. It was not only the priests who lived from the service of Jehovah. Jehovah? Really? But also innumerable grocers, money changers, and artisans. Even the laborers and fishermen of Galilee certainly found markets for their products in Jerusalem. It would be erroneous to think of Palestine as entirely inhabited by Jews. In the north, there were several Greek cities. Almost all the rest was inhabited generally, as each place in particular, by mixed tribes of Egyptians, Arabians, and Phoenicians. Strabo tells us. Jewish proselytism took on increasingly imposing proportions toward the beginning of the Christian era. To be members of so widely ramified and prosperous commercial organization was a prospect that must have been enticing to not a few. As early as 139 BC, the Jews were banished from Rome for recruiting converts. In Antioch, the larger part of the Jewish community consisted of converts. It was solely the economic and social position of the Jews in the diaspora that, even before the fall of Jerusalem, made possible their religious and national cohesion. But while it is obvious that the majority of Jews played a commercial role in the Roman Empire, we must not think that all the Jews were rich traders or entrepreneurs. On the contrary, the majority was certainly made up of ordinary people, some of them making their living directly or indirectly from trade. Peddlers, stevedores, petty artisans, etc. It is this mass of ordinary people that was first hit by the decline of the Roman Empire and suffered most from Roman extortion. Concentrated in great masses in cities, they were capable of greater resistance than the peasant population dispersed in the country. They were also more conscious of their interests. Consequently, the Jewish mass in the great cities will prove to be a continuous cauldron of resistance and uprisings directed simultaneously against Rome and against the rich. It has become traditional to portray the Jewish insurrection in 70 AD as a great national uprising. While this insurrection was directed against the unbearable plunder of the Roman administrators, it was just as resolutely hostile to the native wealthy classes. All the aristocrats took a stand against the revolt. King Agrippa and other Jewish members of the wealthy classes strove mightily to extinguish the flames. The zealots first had to massacre these good people before they could get at the Romans. King Agrippa and Berenice, after the failure of their efforts at conciliation, were to be found not alongside the insurgents, but side by side with the Romans. The members of the ruling classes who, like Flavius Josephus, had assumed the guise of wishing to aid the revolutionaries, rushed to betray them shamefully. The revolt in Judea was not the only one of its kind. Several broke out in the Greek cities during the reign of Vespasian, ruled 69 to 79. An intense social agitation was conducted by the Cynic philosophers whom Vespasian had to drive out of the cities. The residents of Alexandria also showed their hostile feelings to Vespasian. The example of Bithynia and the disturbances in Alexandria under Trajan, ruled 98 to 117, show that the social antagonism of which we have spoken never subsided in Asia Minor or Egypt. But social unrest was not confined to the urban masses. Even though they were the most affected by the growing decay in economic life, the peasant masses also began to move. The condition of the peasants was already very bad in the 1st and 2nd centuries. The situation of the latter grew steadily worse. The conditions under which the masses of the Egyptian population lived were far from normal. Taxation was oppressive, the mode of collection was brutal and unfair. Under Marcus Aurelius, ruled 161 to 180, the discontent spread to all provinces. Spain refused to supply soldiers. Gaul was full of deserters. The revolt spread in Spain, in Gaul, in Africa. In a petition to Emperor Commodus, the small African farmers declared, "We shall flee to a place where we will be able to live like free men." During the reign of Septimus Severus, ruled 193 to 11, banditry took on unheard of proportions. Bands of homeless ravaged various parts of the empire. In a petition, a copy of which has been found recently, the small farmers of Lydia in Asia Minor addressed Septimus Severus in these terms: "When the tax collectors of the emperor appear in the villages, they bring nothing good. They torment the inhabitants with unbearable levies and fines." Other petitions speak of the brutality and arbitrariness of the tax officials. The poverty of the urban and rural masses offered a fertile soil for the propagation of Christianity. Rostov correctly sees a link between the Jewish revolts and the popular revolts in Egypt and in Cyrenaica under the reigns of Trajan and Hadrian, ruled 117 to 138. It was among the poor layers of the great cities of the diaspora that Christianity spread. The first communistic congregation, Messiah, was formed in Jerusalem. But congregations soon arose in other cities having a Jewish proletariat. The oldest stations of Phoenician land, sea commerce, were also the most ancient seats of Christianity. Just as the Jewish insurrections were followed by insurrections of the non-Jewish masses, so did the Jewish communist religion rapidly find its extension among these pagan masses. The primitive Christian community was not born on the terrain of Orthodox Judaism. It was tightly bound up with tyrannical sects. It was under the influence of the Essenes, a Jewish communist sect that, according to Philo, possessed neither property, houses, slaves, lands, or flocks. They tilled the soil and were forbidden to engage in trade. Christianity, in its beginnings, must be considered as a reaction of the laboring masses of Jewish people against the domination of the wealthy commercial classes. Jesus, driving the merchants out of the temple, expresses the hatred of the Jewish popular masses against their oppressors, their hostility to the leading role of the wealthy merchants. At the start, the Christians formed only small communities of no great importance. But in the 2nd century AD, an era of great poverty in the Roman Empire, they succeeded in becoming an extremely powerful party. In the 3rd century, the Christian church acquired enormous strength. In the 3rd century, evidence of Christianity greatly increased in Alexandria. The popular, anti-plutocratic character of primitive Christianity is incontestable. Blessed are ye poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are ye that hunger now, for ye shall be filled. But woe unto you that are rich, woe unto you, ye that are full now, for ye shall hunger, states the Gospel according to Luke 6:20, 6:21, 6:24, 6:25. The Epistle of James is equally positive. Come now, ye rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver are rusted, and their rust shall be for a testimony against you, and shall eat your flesh as fire. Behold, the hire of the laborers who mowed your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, crieth out, and the cries of them that reaped have entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. James 5:1, 5:4. But with the rapid development of Christianity, its leaders labored to blunt its anti-plutocratic edge. The Gospel according to Matthew shows the change that has taken place. There it is stated, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Matthew 5:3, 5:6. The poor have become the poor in spirit. The kingdom of God is now only the kingdom of heaven. The famished now only hunger for righteousness. The revolutionary religion of popular masses is changed to a religion of consolation for these same masses. Gotta read Foundation. I gotta read that on there. Kautsky compared this phenomenon to social democratic visionism. Have to remember that Kautsky wrote about this stuff before he too became a social democratic visionist. It would be more accurate to compare this evolution to the fascist phenomenon we are experiencing at the present time. Oh, that's a hot take. That's a fucking hot take. Mind the French, but that is a hot take. Oh my god. Fascism also attempts to make use of socialism in order to strengthen the rule of finance capital. Indeed. It unhesitatingly uses the most brazen falsehood to deceive the masses, to represent the rule of the tycoons of heavy industry as the rule of labor. Nevertheless, the fascist revolution also has a certain economic and social content. It definitely closes the liberal epoch and inaugurates the epoch of the complete domination of monopoly capitalism, the antithesis of free competitive capitalism. Similarly, it is inadequate merely to say that Christianity became an instrument for deceiving the poor classes. It also became the ideology of the class of landed proprietors who seized absolute power under Constantine. Its triumph coincided with the complete triumph of a natural economy. Simultaneously with Christianity, feudal economy spread all over Europe. Huh. Interesting way of putting it. That's interesting. He's very. I would have to know how accurate is this? How accurate would this claim be? I mean, like the ruling classes of Rome really did just co-opt Christianity. That's like a kind of fashion. That was like a kind of. That's insane. That is nuts. Hmm. It is certainly false to hold Christianity responsible for the fall of the empire. Of course, you can't really blame ideas for anything, because ideas are material machines. But it furnished the ideological armament for the classes that arose on its ruins. The most simple interest on loans was condemned by the clergy of the East and West. It thus took in hand the interests of the new possessing class whose entire wealth came solely from the land. The primary reason for the failure of proletarian Christianity and the triumph of fascist Christianity must be sought in the backward state of the mode of production of this epoch. Oh, this feels vindicating. Hearing him compare like the decline of Christianity to fascism is so vindicating. It's fucking based, is what it is. It is based. Oh my god. That is so based. I am feeling very vindicated right now. Oh, that's crazy. This does not mean that the poor classes accepted the triumph of Catholicism without resistance. The lush growth of heresies furnishes the best proof that the contrary was true. If the official if the official church persecuted these heresies with such great fury, it was because they represented, at least in part, the interests of the poor classes. That that's an interesting hypothesis. Hmm. And I can see how in many cases that could be true. I could see that. I mean, really, I think there's really like three forms of Christianity, I guess I would say. There's ones that are based on faith. They are an opium of the masses. Like ones that are based solely on faith are just an opiate of the masses. It's really that simple. They are a pacifying force. Then there is the versions that are based on knowledge, like Gnosticism, that kind of stuff. I would probably say that is also to a degree an opiate because it seeks comfort in the knowledge to attain salvation in like it's sort of so salvation through faith is like definitely an opiate of the masses. Salvation through knowledge, like the Gnostic tradition, is probably kind of the same, but maybe a little bit better because at least it's not fully complacency, but I don't know. But a but the kind of Christianity that is predicated not on faith, not on knowledge, but on works. That, depending on what those works are, critically, depending on what those works are deemed to be, that can be revolutionary, because that then has a practical material basis. That's very fascinating, very enlightening. Like, I can definitely see how there would have been, like, and I've sort of, and there is like an Eastern Orthodox Christian I talk to it, like, this makes an awful lot of sense. Come to think of it, that like a lot of the heresies that were fought against, or at least probably not all of them, I would not say all of them, but at least some of them must have been like on a class basis. Like later on, not so much like during the rise per se, like during like the first and second centuries, it's probably a bit like more of a, there probably is more of like a doctrinal differencing. Um, but once Christianity actually takes hold of the Roman state, I can certainly see how a lot of like, crackdown against heresy could be like a form of class struggle. Like, could have in reality basically been a form of class struggle manifesting itself in different traditions of Christianity. That's that is a crazy hypothesis, and I could definitely see it. But yeah, let's continue. An author of the 4th century writes of Constantinople. This city, he says, is full of slaves and craftsmen who are all of them profound theologians and preach in the shops and in the streets. Ask a man to change a piece of money for you, and he will tell you wherein the son is different from the father. Ask another the price of a loaf of bread. He will reply that the son is lower than the father. Should you inquire if your bath is ready, you will be told that the sun was created out of nothing. Oh, there's an interesting one for the last comparison of like oh like the sort of later Christianity to like fashion. Um, they were a manifestation of the decline of Roman economy, but the oppressed classes were not equal to the task of taking power. A new possessing class used its ideology to impose its rule. A change was necessary. It took place exclusively to the profit of its new class. The same is true, mutatis mutandis, for the fascist revolution. That's crazy. That comparison is actually insane. That's but it makes so much sense. It does make an awful lot of sense though. It's vindicated. As we have seen, Christianity was originally the ideology of the poor Jewish masses. The first churches were formed around synagogues. The Judeo-Christians had their own gospel, which was called the Gospel according to the Hebrews. What? What was the Gospel according to the Hebrews? What? fuck is the gospel according to the Hebrews? I gotta look this shit up. Gospel according to the Hebrews. What? It is a lost Jewish Christian gospel that was referenced by early church fathers, but no complete manuscript has survived. Oh, interesting. I hope we find that one day. That would be very interesting to read. I hope we find a complete manuscript. That would be crazy. Yeah, wow. Learn something new every day. But probably the Judeo-Christians disappeared quite rapidly in the great Christian community and assimilated into the great mass of converts. After the 3rd century, epoch of the great expansion of Christianity, we hear no more of the Jewish community of Alexandria. It is probable that the majority of Alexandrian Jews entered the bosom of the church. The Alexandrian Church for a certain time acquired hegemony within the new religion. At the Council of Nicaea, 325, it played a leading role relative to the other Christian communities. But while the peasant layers of the Jewish population ardently embraced the teachings of Jesus, the same was not true of the ruling and commercial classes. On the contrary, they ardently persecuted primitive conquest religion. Later, when Christianity became the religion of the great proprietors, when its initial anti-plutocratic tendencies were limited to trade and usury, obviously, even then, opposition to it by the well-to-do Jewish classes could have lost none of its sharpness. On the contrary, Jews became more and more conscious of their own role. Despite the decline of the empire, the role of trade was far ended. The ruling classes still needed luxury products of the East. If the Jews played an important role in trade in preceding epochs, they now became practically the sole intermediaries between the East and the West. Jew became more and more the synonym for merchant. The triumph of a natural economy and of Christianity thus allowed the completion of the selective process that transformed the Jews into a commercial class. Toward the end of the Roman Empire, there certainly still existed groups of Jews whose primary occupation was agriculture or cattle raising in Arabia, Babylonia, North Africa. The Jews had certainly not disappeared in Palestine. Far from it. Contrary to the opinion of idealist historians and ideologists, the Palestinian Jews were not dispersed to the four corners of the earth by the Romans. We have seen that the diaspora had other roots. In 484, the emperors had a great deal of difficulty suppressing a violent revolt of Samad peasants. At the beginning of the 7th century, the Jews attacked Tyre, devastating its environs. In 614, the Jewish battalions of Tiberias, Nazareth, and Galilee assisted the Persian king in conquering Jerusalem, where a host of its inhabitants were slaughtered. Even in the time of the Mohammedan invasion, the Jews, according to Caro, constituted the bulk of the Palestinian population. The Mohammedan conquest produced the same effects there that it did in all conquered countries. The subjugated population was progressively assimilated by the conquerors, just as Egypt completely lost its own character under Mohammedan rule, so Palestine was definitively robbed of its Jewish character. Even today, certain rights of Arab peasants in Palestine recall their Jewish origin. Take that, you Zionist scum! This is a fucking Jew debunking your stupid shit about the Jews being expelled. There you fucking go. They all converted to Islam. They converted to Islam. Didn't take a fucking rocket scientist for me to figure that out. That they converted to fucking Islam. That's really, it was really as simple as that. They were not expelled and now they're all coming back. That was the diaspora, most of whom were fucking converts. The Jews who were in Palestine, most of them just converted to Islam. They assimilated. There you fucking go. And now I know even more concretely why that is. They were assimilated because they weren't merchants. He says this thing when they lose their class character that is distinct, they tend to assimilate. Which, I mean, how true that is today, I'm not exactly sure. But there you fucking go. Zionists, stop telling fucking lies. I know you're not going to stop because it's in your fucking interest to keep lying about this shit. But, that's why I'm reading these books. Hopefully people actually see them and see that you're full of fucking shit. More people need to read this book and see that you are full of fucking shit, every single one of you. You Zionists are full of fucking shit. Fucking hell. Sorry, I shouldn't be swearing so much, but God. In other countries as well, the Jewish agricultural groups or herders were subjected to strong assimilationist pressure and succumbed sooner or later. And that is the essential phenomenon more and more discernible through historical evolution. Only the Jewish communities with a clearly defined commercial character, numerous in Italy, in Gaul, in Germany, etc., proved capable of resisting all attempts at assimilation. What remains of the pastoral Jewish tribes of Arabia or the Jewish farmers of North Africa? Nothing but legends. As against this, the Jewish commercial colonies of Gaul, Spain, and Germany developed flourishing. One can only say, therefore, that if the Jews have been preserved, it was not despite their dispersion, but because of it. If there had been no diaspora prior to the fall of Jerusalem, if the Jews had remained in Palestine, there is no reason to believe their fate would have been different from that of all the other nations of antiquity. The Jews, like the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, would have mixed with the conquering nations, would have adopted their religion and their customs. Even if the present inhabitants of Palestine would have continued to bear the name of Jews, they would have had as little in common with the ancient Hebrews as the inhabitants of Egypt, Syria, and Greece have with their ancestors of antiquity. All the peoples of the Roman Empire were carried away in its fall. Only the Jews have been preserved. They alone brought into the barbarian world, followed upon the Roman, vestiges of the commercial development that characterized the ancient world. After the Mediterranean world was dismembered, they continued, among themselves, to link its scattered parts together. That is That is pretty crazy. It makes so much sense now. So okay. So I'm going to make a prediction here. I'm going to make a prediction about what this is going to get to regarding the solution to the Jewish question and how it's relevant to communism. Which is that communism would rid the Jews of their commercial character, and thus they would end up assimilating. Like that, with communism, the Jews would simply cease to exist. Not through genocide or something, but simply through assimilation. I think that's what this is going to get to. So, I mean, that seems like what this is getting to. Basically, that communism will just assimilate the Jews, which, I mean, like, based on what I'm reading so far, and what this sort of trend seems to be that they assimilate when they lose their commercial character. Did Zionism just delay the inevitable? Or is Zionism like, I mean, we'll have to get to that towards the end. And he talks about Zionism towards the end. So, yeah, okay. Finish chapter 2. D. The Jews after the fall of the Roman Empire. It is consequently the transformation of the Jewish nation into a class that is at the bottom of the preservation of Judaism. In the epoch of the ruin of the Roman Empire, their commercial role continued to gain in importance. While the Jews had already participated in world commerce prior to the fall of the Roman Empire, they attained even greater prosperity after its end. It is probable that the Syrian merchants referred to in the same period were also Jews. Such a confusion was common in antiquity. Ovid, for example, speaks of the day unsuited to business, on which every week falls the festival celebrated by the Syrians of Palestine. Yeah, that sounds like the Sabbath. That sounds like the Sabbath. In the 4th century, the Jews belonged to the well-to-do and wealthy layers of the population. Chrysostom states that the Jews possessed large sums of money and that their patriarchs assembled immense treasures. He speaks of the wealth of the Jews as if it were a fact well known to his contemporaries. For many centuries, the Jews continued to be the sole commercial intermediaries between the East and the West. Spain and France progressively became the centers of Jewish life. The Arab postmaster in Spain, Ibn Khordadbeh, in the Book of Routes, 857 to 874, mentions the Radamite Jews who speak Persian, Roman, Arab, and Frankish, Spanish, and Slav languages. They voyage from the Occident to the Orient, and from the Orient to the Occident, now by land and now by sea. They bring from the Occident eunuchs, women slaves, boys, silk, furs, and swords. They embark in the land of Franks on the Western Sea and sail to Faramar, Palestine. They proceed to Sind, India, and China. On returning, they are laden with musk, aloes, camphor, cinnamon, and other products of eastern lands. Some set sail for Constantinople in order to sell their merchandise there. Others repair to the country of Frank. Theodulf's verses relating to the wealth of the Orient doubtless referred to the goods imported by the Jews. Spain is further mentioned in the text of a formula agreed by Louis the Pious with reference to the Jew Abraham of Saragossa. The Jews, therefore, were the purveyors of spices and costly fabrics. But we see from Agabard's texts that they also dealt in wine, and on the banks of the Danube they traded in salt. In the 10th century, the Jews possessed salt mines in Nuremberg. They also traded in arms and exploited the treasuries of the churches. But their great specialty was their trade in slaves. Some of these slaves were sold in the country, but the majority were exported to Spain and for other merchandise, just as has been the custom under other kings. According to Brutzkus, the name Radamites, which a section of the Jewish merchants had, comes from the river Rodan, Rhone, from which their ships sailed. In various chronicles, the designation of Norte Rodanici, Rhone river merchants, is also to be found. There can be no doubt that in the Carolingian period, the Jews were the principal intermediaries between the East and the West. Their already dominant position in trade in the epoch of the decline of the Roman Empire was excellent preparation for this role. It's not people. True. One. Then they were treated as equals of the Roman citizens. The poet Rutilius complained that the vanquished nation was oppressing the conquerors. In the middle of the 4th century, Jewish traders had settled in Tongres and Tournai in present-day Belgium. The bishops had the best relations with them and strongly encouraged their trade. In 470, Apollinaris Sidonius asked the bishop of Tournai to receive a certain Jew favorably, in view of the fact that these people generally did a very fine business. In the 6th century, Gregory of Tours speaks of colonies of Jews in Clermont Ferrand and in Orleans. Lyons similarly had a large population of Jewish traders at this time. The Archbishop of Lyons, Agabard, complains in his De Insolentia Judaeorum, on the insolence of Jews, that the Jews were selling Christian slaves in Spain. A document from the 9th century mentions a Jew living in the country of the Franks, who brought precious things from the Orient. It is consequently obvious that in the first centuries of the Middle Ages, the Jews in France were primarily traders. In Flanders, where the Jews lived from the Norman invasions up to the First Crusade, 1096 to 99, trade was lodged in their hands. Toward the end of the 9th century, there was a large Jewish community in Huy. The Jews occupied an important position there and had a flourishing trade. In 1040, in Liege, trade was in their hands. In Spain, all foreign trade was exploited by them. This trade extended over all the country's provisions: wine, oil, minerals. Cloth and spices reached them from the Levant. The same was true of Gaul. The Jews of Poland and Little Russia also came to Western Europe in order to sell slaves, furs, and salt there, and to buy all kinds of cloth. We read in a Hebraic source of the 12th century that the Jews purchased large quantities of Flemish fabric on the Rhenish markets in order to trade them in Russia for furs. Jewish trade between Mainz and Kiev, according to Pirene, the most important trade post of the southern plain, was very intensive. There was certainly an important trading colony of Jews in Kiev in this period, since we read in a chronicle of 1113 that in order to prevail upon Monarch, Constantine IX, Emperor of the Orient, to come to Kiev as soon as possible. The inhabitants of this city let him know that the population was prepared to pillage the boyars, feudal lords, and the Jews. The Arabian traveller Ibrahim al-Tartwahi similarly attests to the scope of Jewish trade in Europe and the Orient. He writes in 973 on visiting Mainz, "It is marvellous to find at such a distant point in the West spices originating in the most remote East." An account published under the name of the Jew Ben-Gurion, not Ben-Gurion, Ben-Gurion, the book by the Arab-Persian geographer Qazwini, and a travel report by the Spanish Jew Ibrahim ibn Yaqub in the 10th century, all mention the price of wheat in Krakow and Prague and speak of salt mines belonging to Jews. According to Gumplowers, the Jews were the sole intermediaries between the shores of the Baltic and Asia. An old document thus characterizes the Khazars, a Mongol tribe of the Caspian Sea that became converted to Judaism. They have no slaves to the land because they buy everything by means of money. Itil, the capital of the Khazars, was a great commercial center, the starting point for the transport of goods eventually ending up in Mainz. The convert Hermann relates in an autobiographical work that while he was still a Jew, he traveled regularly when he was 20 years old, about 1127, between Cologne and Mainz in pursuit of commercial matters, for all Jews are engaged in trade. It's a Latin phrase, I won't worry about that. The words of Rabbi Elisa ben Natan, circa 1090 to circa 1170, are also characteristic of the period. Trade, but that is our principal means of subsistence. The Jews were the only class to make its living by trading. At the same time, thanks to the contracts which they maintained among themselves, they were the only economic link which survived between East and West. The situation of the Jews in the first half of the Middle Ages was therefore extremely favorable. They were considered part of the upper classes of society, and their juridical position was not perceptibly different from that of the nobility. Under Charles the Bold, the Edict of Pistis, 864, punished the sale of impure gold or silver by the whip when serfs or those liable to forced labor were involved, and by a money fine when the culprits were Jews or freemen. The Jews of the earlier period filled a great need in the general economy which for a long time could not be filled by anybody else, namely the need for carrying on a professional trade in goods. Bourgeois historians generally do not see any great difference between commerce and usury in antiquity and the Middle Ages on the one hand, and the capitalism of our epoch on the other. However, as between medieval trade and the usury linked to it and modern capitalism, there is at least as much distance as that between the feudal lord and the big capitalist proprietor working for the market, as between the serf or the slave and the modern proletarian. In the epoch of the commercial prosperity of the Jews, the prevailing mode of production was feudal. Essentially, it was use values produced and not exchange values. Each domain was self-sufficient. Only certain luxury products, spices, precious fabrics, etc., were objects of exchange. The lords yielded a portion of the gross products of their lands for the rare merchandise coming from the Orient. Feudal society, based on the production of use values, and capitalism in its commercial and usurious primitive form, do not exclude one another, but complement each other. The independent and preponderant development of capital in the form of commercial capital is synonymous with the non-subjection of production to capital. The independent development of commercial capital thus stands in inverse proportion to the general economic development of society. When commercial capital exchanges the products of undeveloped communities, commercial profit not only appears as defrauding and cheating, but to a large extent does derive precisely from this. Apart from the fact that it exploits the difference between production prices in various countries, and in this connection it acts to equalize and establish commodity values, these modes of production enable commercial capital to appropriate for itself a preponderant part of the surplus product, partly by acting as middlemen between communities whose production is still basically oriented to use value, so that the sale of that part of their product that in some way or other steps into circulation, and thus the sale of products at their value in general, is of subordinate importance for their economic organization. And partly because in those earlier modes of production, the principal proprietors of the surplus product whom the merchant trades with, i.e. the slave owner, feudal lord, state, e.g. the Oriental despot, represent the consumption wealth which the merchant sets out to trap. From an economic standpoint, modern commercial or banking capital is only an appendage to industrial capital and appropriates only a part of the surplus value created in the process of capitalist production. But merchant and usury capital realizes profits by benefiting from differences in the costs of production of various countries and by taking for itself a portion of the surplus value extorted by the feudal lords from their serfs. While one part of the capital is being transformed into money, so as later to be transformed back into commodities, the other part is simultaneously being transformed to commodities, so as to later be transformed back into money. The Jewish merchant did not invest money in production, as the merchant of the great medieval cities does several centuries later. He does not purchase raw materials nor finance the draper artisans. His commercial capital is simply the mediating movement between extremes it does not dominate and preconditions it does not create. Lending at interest, usury, is closely linked to commerce. If accumulated wealth in the hands of the feudal class implies luxury, and the trade that serves to procure it, Luxury, in its turn, becomes the distinctive hallmark of wealth. In the beginning, accumulated surplus product allows the lord to acquire spices, oriental fabric, silks. Later, all these products become the attributes of the ruling class. The clothes begin to make the man. And when regular income does not allow the proprietor class to lead the kind of life it has become accustomed to, it must borrow. A second personage is added to the merchant, the usurer. Generally, in this period, the second personage is identical with the first. Only the merchant has the necessary cash for the rich, noble wastrel. But it is not alone the lord who has recourse to the usurer. When the king has to assemble an army immediately, and the normal revenue from taxation is inadequate, he is compelled to go to the man with the cash. When the peasant, because of a bad harvest, an epidemic, or the overwhelming burden of taxes, forced contributions, and compulsory service, can no longer meet his obligations, when he has eaten up his seed, when he can no longer replace his worn-out tools, he must borrow from the usurer to meet his needs. The treasury of the usurer is therefore indispensable to a society based on a natural economy. It is the reserve on which society draws when various accidental circumstances intervene. Interest-bearing capital, or, to describe it in its archaic form, usurious capital, belongs together with its twin brother, merchant's capital, to the antediluvian forms of capital, which long precede the capitalist mode of production, and are to be found in the most diverse socio-economic formations. Often the kings and great lords invested with dues the wealth collected through taxes and other revenues. And then we see Jews appearing in the role of tax farmers, revenue collectors. The finance ministers of the kings of the High Middle Ages, beginning in the 11th century, were often Jews. In Spain, up to the end of the 14th century, the great Jewish bankers were also tax farmers. In Poland, the kings entrusted to the Jews the important functions of the financial administration of their domains. Under Casimir the Great, ruled 1333 to 70, and Władysław Jagiello, ruled 1386 to 1434, not only was the collection of public taxes farmed out to the Jews, but also such important sources of revenue as the royal mint and salt mines. Thus, for example, we know that in the second half of the 14th century, the Rothschild of Krakow, Luko, the banker to three Polish kings, held the lease on the famous salt mines of Wieliczka and Bochnia, and also administered the mint in Krakow. As long as a natural economy reigned, the Jews were indispensable to it. It is its decline that gives the signal for persecutions against the Jews and will for a long time exert an adverse influence on their situation. And I'm going to finish it there. That is the end of chapter 2. I just dropped the book. Okay. This has been very interesting. A very interesting one compared to usual. Yeah. So it is very some interesting stuff in there that's to note. The stuff about like comparing the decline of early Christian communism to like fascism, like that was crazy. Um, and I mean the stuff about a lot of the like agricultural Jews that remain in Palestine converting from Islam, completely unsurprising to me. It didn't take a rocket scientist to figure that shit out. Like it did. But it's the hypothesis that I think this is getting to. That basically the solution of the Jewish question and how it applies to communism is that communism will basically just lead to the Jews fully assimilating, so they'll cease to exist. Which is interesting, to say the least. And I'm going to try to make a vague prediction about what his criticism of Zionism is going to be. That it affirms the national identity of the Jews, where they should be assimilated. I and also I guess um, he probably affirmed the fact that it was always meant to be like an imperialist thing from the get go. So I mean, it'll be interesting to see um, where this story continues to go, especially as we get towards this critique of Zionism. But yeah, that's pretty much going to be it for tonight. For tonight's Saturday reading stream. Of course, I'll be back for the Tuesday reading stream to continue reading Vladimir Lenin's Imperialism, the Higher Stage of Capitalism. And then for the next week's Thursday gaming stream, I will be finishing off Carol's story in Freedom Planet. So look forward to that. And that is pretty much where I'm going to leave it off for tonight. So thanks for watching.